as we always say, history is so important to understand any situation we're in. And so to give more context to all the things we talked about, we're going to do a little special segment of radical military history.
Radical.
Military. History.
Today, your soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guard are better educated than before, are better informed, and understand what the war is all about.
So for this episode segment of Radical Military History, we're going to give some more context to the three countries that are part of this migrant caravan. We know that Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are the three countries that pretty much all of the migrants on the caravan are coming from. And so, of course, the U.S. military has a pretty great role in shaping the current situation for all of those countries. These three countries we mentioned were essentially owned just by United Fruit Company alone, and of course other mining giants that were, ravaging the country for its natural resources. And for hundreds of years, a small group of local elites were empowered by these colonial powers, while 99% of the population was sentenced to slave labor and poverty. In the 1950s, movements of the poor started to be able to get organized and fight back. And as soon as that happened, as soon as United Fruit Company's profits were threatened, the United States began a strategy of brute military force, coups, propping up dictators, all sorts of horrible, horrible things to protect corporate profit. As part of that, they started something called the School of the Americas, which of course still exists today. Spencer, you were at Benning, which is where the School of the Americas is, but it's changed its name recently, right? What is it, WinSec?
Yeah, so it's currently known as the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. Abbreviated to WinSec, and it's still alive and well and just as active as it was during its inception.
And so we're going to get a little bit about what those types of actions were. But before we get into the negative side of this lesson, we want to introduce the topic with a really heroic figure in radical military history, and that's a veteran named Roy Bourgeois. Roy Bourgeois was an officer who did 2 tours in Vietnam. On his first tour, he was wounded in action and received a Purple Heart. But when he returned from Vietnam, Roy Bourgeois became a priest and went to Bolivia to work with the poor. It was there in the 1970s that he started to see what the U.S. government was doing there and in Latin America as a whole. Now, these U.S.-backed militias who were supposedly fighting for democracy were specifically targeting clergy because the clergy were advocating for the rights of the poor. So Father Roy found himself in yet another war zone. Then in 1980, U.S.-backed death squads in El Salvador, a country which we'll be talking more about, murdered 4 American women who worked for the Catholic Church. 3 of them were nuns and 2 were personal friends of Father Roy. Not long after that, 6 Jesuit priests in El Salvador were massacred by the same death squads, and so Father Roy went to El Salvador. And I wanted to play a quick clip of him talking about what he learned there. This is from a documentary that I produced called The U.S. School That Trained Dictators and Death Squads, which you can find on YouTube. Here is Roy Bourgeois.
I was more fearful in El Salvador than I was in Vietnam. I spent a year in the military in Vietnam. I've never seen such abuse of power, such brutality of a military. I thought Bolivia was bad. This is far worse. There was no accountability. How could they rape and kill nuns who were working with the poor? How could they assassinate a bishop in church who's talking about the poor? What got us started was to see our country deeply involved, giving about $1 million a day in military aid. The guns that were killing people was paid for by our tax money. But the big thing when we learned that those who did the killing not only used our guns, they were trained in the United States at the U.S. Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. Many in our country with power saw what was going on in Latin America as a threat to their wealth and power. They could lose it. And therefore, of course, they are not going to go out and torture people and kill. This is where the military is essential. They won't do the dirty work. Oh, no. They'll talk the macho talk. We've got to go and we have to, like, when we have to go off to Vietnam, we have to go fight. No, they're not going to go. They will send young men and others to do their killing for them. They're cowards, basically. And so, so the School of the Americas was justified. And it was at a distance. They didn't really see the blood. They didn't hear the screams of someone tortured. They used others to do their dirty work for them. But it was all about an addiction to power, as many of us saw it. The biggest course there, counterinsurgency. Who were the insurgents? They were the landless farmers, the campesinos, who were doing what we would do if we were going to bed hungry at night and seeing our children die before their time. You begin to speak out, organize, and call for a living wage. They were the targets. The church women who were coming back to the U.S., every now and then to inform members of Congress what was going on there. They were the targets, religious leaders, especially labor leaders, union leaders, university students, healthcare workers, anyone that would be calling for reform, a living wage, health care, running water, adequate housing. Comunista, you are a communist. It's about really saving their lives and the lives of their children. It's so bad. If they stay, they die. They die from violence or from hunger. And so they do what we would do. They flee for life.
I want to talk about Father Roy as a part of radical military history because he wasn't just a Vietnam veteran who then switched sides and then, took the side of the people that the U.S. was targeting. He is really the one that built the campaign around raising awareness about what the School of the Americas was and what it was doing around the world. And the way that he brought this into mainstream consciousness and public consciousness and created all types of media scandals for the Army and for the School of the Americas, he did this by, he got his blood drawn and he had his blood in all of these vials on his body and he snuck on to Fort Benning, Georgia. And he went to the steps of the School of the Americas on Fort Benning and took out his vials of blood and splattered his blood all over the steps, all over the sign, all over the door, just made a mess with his fluids. And of course, that was a hazmat crisis. They had to have big teams clean it up. And it was a big media story. And he went to jail for 1.5 years in federal prison for that action. That would just be his first prison term for civil disobedience against School of the Americas. Collectively, he spent 4 years in federal prison doing different civil disobedience actions to draw attention to the School of the Americas, and then became the leader of this group called SOA Watch, which had regular actions at Fort Benning, led by victims of School of the Americas graduates to bring attention to it. And that's actually one of the reasons that they changed the name to WINSEC, is because there was so much stigma attached to the name School of the Americas through the work of Vietnam veteran Roy Bourgeois. And so that's the introduction to this thing called the School of the Americas. And we're going to talk about what exactly the School of the Americas and the U.S. military as a whole has done in each of these three countries that people are now fleeing from: El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras.
To begin with Honduras, to give you a little bit of an overview of the situation there, there's been 8 U.S. military interventions in the country since 1890. So over 100 years of U.S. interference in the region. Of course, the most glaringly obvious one, and the one we're most familiar with currently, comes from 2009, when the U.S. orchestrated coup removed the democratically elected, popular progressive President Zelaya. 4 of 6 of the generals involved in the coup were School of the Americas graduates.
Honduras today, I mean, no one will deny that all of the violence in Honduras today has been since the coup in 2009. I mean, it just unleashed such a horrific era. I mean, it's like the most dangerous country in the world for journalists now, because the government just murders journalists who try to report against the government. I mean, they've ushered in a fascist state. This was done with the knowledge of the State Department in 2009. And so most of the case we're going to go into are the history is through the 80s, but this is very recent. I mean, this is not old news. This isn't just 30 years ago when the U.S. has been determining the outcome of what's the governments in these countries. In the very recent history, we've seen this happen, and that's why so many people are fleeing from Honduras.
So, of course, it's not just limited to Honduras. We also want to go into El Salvador a little bit more in depth.
You heard earlier Roy Bourgeois talk about his firsthand experience in El Salvador. El Salvador also has had several military interventions in the past 100 years to determine the outcome of their government. Most significantly, though, between the years 1981 and 1992, the United States government and military funded and aided on the ground death squads. Anyone who was progressive to the left of fascism was targeted. And through that 10-year period, these US-backed death squads murdered over 75,000 people and succeeded in completely crushing the progressive people's movement in that country. And I just want to list a couple examples of how heinous that really was and the role of the School of the Americas and the US military in it. In 1981, a village of El Huanquilo, US-backed forces massacred an entire village, 70 civilians, 40 of them children, were all massacred. All of the women in this village were raped before being killed, including several girls who were under the age of 12. And while the U.S. forces weren't there themselves, U.S. proxy forces were. So in that incident, in that massacre, 3 officers were cited by the UN for war crimes. 2 of those 3 officers were graduates of the School of the Americas. Now, that incident, heinous as it sounds, was nothing in comparison to the massacre at El Mozote. On December 11th, 1981, US-backed forces captured an entire village, surrounded the village. They lined everyone up. They separated men and women. They brought men into one building and boys into one building, and they brutally tortured all of them. They brought all the women and girls into another building. They raped every single one of them. And then they killed every single person in the village. Over 200 civilians were massacred. And not just adults. I mean, it's gruesome, but there is children discovered who were 2 years old who were hung from trees with their throats slit. 12 officers were cited by the UN for war crimes in the massacre. 10 of those officers were School of the Americas graduates, trained and working with the United States military. Of course, during that time also, 1980 to 1985, the U.S. had installed a dictator, Roberto Arrieta, who was directly responsible for the death of around 30,000 people. And this, U.S.-backed dictator, who was very much praised by the U.S. government, he was known as Blowtorch Bob because he was personally known for taking a blowtorch, like a blue flame blowtorch, and using it on people's genitalia during torture. And this is the guy that the U.S. thought was this great beacon of democracy. And so that's the history of El Salvador that you need to know. It could be a very different country today, but when the people of El Salvador wanted to determine their own destiny, the U.S. unleashed this really, really most despicable force you can think of that turned the country into